Hello, my name is Matthew Jenkins. I am a senior history student here at Goucher College, and today I will present some of my research on the all-women Irish paramilitary organization known as Cumann. Cumann was active from 1914 until the struggles of the 1960s, but their scope of my project is firmly between 1914 and 1923, focusing primarily on their roles in the Easter Rising, the Irish War for Independence, and the Civil War. In this presentation, I hope to go over my research process, my reasonings for focusing on this topic, and what I bring to the field of modern Irish history, Irish women's history, and the history of Cumann specifically. Beginning with a reflection on how I stumbled into this topic, I come from a self-described Scots-Irish American family that also has a deep love of folk music. Growing up, it was not uncommon to hear Irish rebel songs playing within my home. However, one song always stuck out to me, the Foggy Dew. It had this somberness to it, this melancholic quality, which existed as a juxtaposition to the usually humorous or light-hearted Irish rebel songs like Kinky Boots or Come Out Ya Black and Tans. What really caught my attention, however, were the lyrics. In my childhood, I remember feeling drawn to the story of heroism and martyrdom that they described, but also failing to grasp their actual content. I imagined a great battle of good versus evil, where the Irish heroes lined up on one side and the British villains on the other. I didn't know it then, but the Foggy Dew planted a seed in my mind that would germinate for many years. When it came time to pick a research topic, I remembered that song. I wanted to place it into a context I was now old enough and studied enough to understand. And that's how I came to first learn about the 1916 Easter Uprising, which the Foggy Dew describes. But I also learned something else. I learned about a particular set of participants in that uprising that neither my favorite childhood song nor my Wikipedia deep dives told me about, the presence of women. Cumann, Irish Gaelic for the Council of Irish Women, was one of 5 groups who staged and participated in the Easter Rebellion, the event later touted as the beginning of the Irish Republic. Coming from a background in writing history about marginalized actors, I knew at that point, without a single doubt, what my topic was going to be. I wanted to understand these revolutionary women and to highlight their participation, which had gone largely unsung in the historiography of modern Ireland. Going into the project, I knew I wanted to do a few things. First, I wanted to I wanted to understand what Cumann was exactly. What did the organization stand for? What were its political leanings? And what space within the Irish Revolutionary moment did they occupy? Secondly, I wanted to understand the impact Cumann had on Irish separatist ideology in general, particularly in the post-1916 Easter Rising political climate. Finally, I wanted to apply a form of historical analysis that would allow me to track the ways Cumann itself changed over time. Essentially, I wanted to study the formation of a core Cumann identity and all that that meant. A lot of the historians who wrote on Cumann did so from a distinctly feminist lens. They place Cumann not necessarily within the context of the revolution, but within the context of the suffrage movement. Those who did not follow this path typically viewed Cumann as a blip in the story of Irish revolutionary period, worth mentioning, but not worth dwelling on or emphasizing. I challenge both ideas in my analysis. I find that Cumann's story is one of a group of loosely aligned Irish nationalist women who slowly evolved and rewrote their own group meaning and identity into what would become a highly centralized, extremely politically influential, and extremely politically powerful organization. Now, for some brief background, the early 20th century in Ireland was one of extreme political unrest. Between the suffrage movement of the later 1880s and 90s, the organized labor movement of men like James Connolly and James Larkin, and the ever-growing nationalist and separatist causes, Ireland was ripe for some kind of social upheaval. One of the major political actors of this time was the Irish Parliamentary Party, or just the Parliamentary Party, who were a group of Irish parliamentarians who pushed for the passing of a Home Rule Bill and the creation of a separate Irish Parliament in Dublin. The Parliamentary Party was successful at pushing a Home Rule Bill through the Parliament in 1912. This bill would have given Ireland a separate status from the other nations of the United Kingdom, while keeping them within the empire. In the north of Ireland, in Ulster County, Unionists saw the passing of Home Rule as the beginning of Catholic dominance in Ireland and rejected the passing of the bill. In 1912, the armed resistance group called the Ulster Volunteer Force, or UVF, was founded to combat Home Rule. In retaliation, Irish nationalists like Eoin MacNeill, Eamon de Valera, founded the Irish Volunteers, a parliamentary organization dedicated to fighting for and preserving Irish separatism. Additionally, socialist leader James Connolly founded the Irish Citizen Army, or ICA. On April 2nd, 1914, a meeting of Irish women commenced within Wynn's Hotel in Dublin, wherein mBan was founded. The aims of this new organization were to advance the cause of Irish liberty and to organize Irish women in the furtherance of this object, to assist in arming and equipping a body of Irish men for the defense of Ireland, and to form a fund for these purposes to be called the Defense of Ireland Fund. From the very beginning, mBan placed itself within traditional subsidiary roles to the men of the volunteers. It was also stated in this inaugural meeting that mBan would not concern itself with divisive political topics like suffrage, labor, or parliamentary issues. mBan's political ideology at this time was extremely loose, poorly defined, and susceptible to interpretation by its members. Many members also participated in other political organizations, and also enlisted in both mBan and the ICA, which was an egalitarian army. As things went, however, mBan found itself in situations where it was forced to define itself in greater detail. One such example is the Redmondite split in 1914. Following the outbreak of the First World War, John Redmond, leader of the Parliamentary Party, called on Irish volunteers to enlist in the British Army and fight for the Allied powers. However, nationalists within the volunteers rejected the idea. The Irish volunteers split into anti- and pro-enlistment factions, the Irish volunteers and national volunteers, respectively. mBan, at the time, a poorly defined auxiliary to the Irish volunteers, experienced a schism just as hard. They lost over half their members in the same year in which they were founded. While the blow to membership was certainly hard for those who remained, the Redmondite schism had the added effect of leaving mBan's core ideology far more defined. They were now a distinctly separatist organization, and one who believed in an independent Irish republic. This was an exceptionally important moment in the development of mBan's core group identity and ideology. Moving forward in time now, the 1916 uprising began on April 26, 1916, and ran until April 29th. The ICA, the Irish Volunteers, the Ancient Hibernian Brotherhood, and the Boy Scout organization known as Fianna Éireann and mBan all participated. The rebels would ultimately prove unsuccessful, and its leaders were arrested and publicly executed. However, the women of mBan were almost completely unaffected by the rebellion. The Irish government refused to mass incarcerate the women who participated in a largely support role, and the one member who was tried for murder, Countess Markievicz, was released, quote, on the sole basis of her sex. After the uprising, Irish nationalism was in a troubling position. With the majority of their leaders dead and almost all of their fighting men imprisoned, the future of the Irish Republic seemed tenuous at best. This would prove to be the perfect condition for mBan to grow their influence, expand their purpose, and rise to a level of importance seldom acknowledged by Irish revolutionary historiography. The Central Cumann branch in Dublin created a fund to benefit the families of men killed or imprisoned in the uprising, created community and family daycare centers, hosted nationalist fairs where Gaelic plays and sports were taught and played, hosted free community Gaelic language courses for children and housewives, and sold Irish flags with the faces of executed nationalist leaders sewn onto them, ingratiating the idea of the dead martyrs as representatives of a cause. They also simply behaved as though the Irish Republic had been founded and refused to acknowledge the authority of any British official. For instance, in 1917, Cumann hosted a nationwide Women's Day, wherein they hosted parties and parades in the streets of several major cities without bothering to receive the permits required to do so legally. When Cumann women inevitably clashed with authorities, they oftentimes spoke only in Gaelic and refused to give their Anglican names. When general elections came around in 1918, Cumann mBan mobilized women all over the country in voting for Sinn Féin candidates. In many cases, Cumann women would don disguises and vote several times. The result was a massive Sinn Féin victory, and what many nationalists saw as a legitimate democratic mandate for the separation of Ireland from Great Britain. Thus, in 1919, Ireland declared their first Dáil Éireann, or independent parliament, which led directly into the Irish War for Independence. It is unclear to me whether such an event would have been possible without the political and social influence Cumann mBan had on the post-Easter Rising Irish society. Whether the outcome would have been the same or not, it is clear to me that Cumann mBan was pivotal in the progression of Irish nationalist politics in the time between 1916 and 1919. Women of Cumann mBan played very similar roles in the War for Independence as they did in 1916. They administered medical aid, ran dispatches, smuggled guns, etc. Essentially, the independence they gained while the Irish volunteers sat in prison disappeared once those men were released in 1918 and reformed themselves into the Irish Republican Army, or the IRA. The women of Cumann would experience further betrayal with the outbreak of the Civil War in 1923, wherein the organization split into pro and anti-treaty factions. The anti-treaty core of the group would be denied military legitimacy for decades, with the government refusing them service pensions, recognition, or a place in the history books. While this fate may be anticlimactic to some, it does not detract from the fact that it was Cumann mBan, having refined and rewritten their own identity into a highly nationalist, centralized organization with clear and independent goals, was one of the most prominent and important forces in promoting and pushing for Irish separatism in the years following the failed Easter Rising. Part of me hopes that maybe one day, someone, somewhere, will find the time to write a folk song recognizing this fact and inspiring children to learn about their history. That is all I have prepared. Now I will open up the floor to anybody who has questions. You want me to stop sharing?
Yeah, I think it will be helpful to stop sharing the screen. You can see everyone's face.
Well, what I have is less of a question and more of a bit of a commentary. This is pretty well done, I would say, and honestly, it's just like I didn't quite expect to see this topic from you. Yeah, I didn't know you had such Irish heritage, and if you can, I guess from my name, I share in that too. So when you started talking about the Foggy Dew and listening and hearing old Irish war songs growing up, I was just like, yes, I could definitely relate to that too. So yeah, this presentation definitely struck a chord with me in that regard.
Well, thank you. Natalie?
Yeah, good job. And also I wanted to ask if you know, like, are there any current groups like in Ireland that either have stemmed like directly from Cumann mBan or like or influenced by them?
That is a great question. So following the kind of break into the pro and anti-treaty factions, the anti-treaty faction kind of, like I said, it was suppressed very heavily by the current Irish government, but the pro-treaty faction would actually go on and continue kind of operating in this weird kind of nebulously political organization. And actually in the 1960s, the British government declared Cumann mBan a terrorist organization. So yes, there are actually still branches of Cumann mBan that exist today. It's questionable whether they actually are from like an unbroken chain or if it's more like a nationalist resurgence in the modern time. But yeah, there are groups that still call themselves Cumann mBan. And Cumann mBan kind of continued until roughly the 1960s, where they were disbanded because of the label of terrorist that was kind of like placed on them. Yeah, that was a good question. Professor Hale?
So I enjoyed the presentation a lot. I'm just going to admit my ignorance. I've never heard of this group before, so thank you for teaching me about it, this group. A couple questions. One is just how big was this organization? Do you have numbers, approximation of that? And that question is actually related to a bigger question based on something you said, and I'm not disputing it, I'm just curious. You talked about the group as extremely influential and extremely powerful. And I guess my question, partly I was thinking about numbers, how do you, but how do you measure, and just as a general thing, how do we as historians, what criteria do we use to classify something as extremely influential, extremely powerful? Would if you said they were influential and powerful, would that change the nature of what you're doing or your interpretation? I guess those are my questions.
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. So in 1914, when it was just the Dublin branch of Cumann, their membership was roughly about 40 to about 100 people, depending on like the time. Post-Redmondite split, it decreased significantly. But by the time of 1918 and 1919, which I would describe as like the peak of their influence, they were over 20,000 strong, and they had branches in pretty much every major city in Ireland, and they actually had branches in different parts of the world with like heavy like Irish diaspora. So like there actually was a Cumann branch that opened in Sydney, Australia in 1917. Just like to give an idea of how much women were engaging with politics through this organization. And what I mean by when I say extremely influential is the fact that a lot of the revolutionary ideology was being pushed for a long time by men. Like that's probably a pretty obvious thing to say, but like at the time, politics there was an attempt to limit politics into like male actors only. And so Cumann represented an opportunity for women to engage in politics in a way that was seen as palatable, and so in that post-1916 time, when by and large revolutionary men were either sitting in prison or were sitting at home terrified, Cumann really was the organization that was pushing for propaganda, pushing for Irish separatism, and really like keeping that idea in like fresh in people's minds. For instance, they were largely responsible for the kind of like hero worship that a lot of the Irish leaders in 1916 now experience, because they explicitly made an effort to kind of like memorialize these men after the fact and to like make sure that they were like household names. Additionally, after 1917, women over the age of 30 who owned property were granted the right to vote. And so Cumann now had this incredible political power where they were one of the largest, or actually at the time, the largest in membership, like revolutionary organization in Ireland. And now they had the ability to vote. And like I said in my presentation, they mobilized nationwide to do so, and were largely responsible for the election of like the outward sweep of the 1918 general election for the Revolutionary Party, Sinn Féin. And so I could say, I personally believe that they were exceptionally important and like way more important than the historiography suggests, perhaps. There's been a push to recognize more of their importance in the last 5 years by scholars like McCarthy in his book, Cumann and the Irish Revolutionary Period. But by and large, I do think that there's a case to be made that they were like extremely important for the modern Irish like revolutionary movement. But yeah, that was a great question. I'm sorry if I went on a bit of a tangent there, giving it background, but yeah.
That was great. Thank you.
Professor Contreras?
Thank you for that presentation. I really enjoyed it. I guess I have two questions, but one popped up in your answer to Professor Hill's question, which is if you had to own land, then what was the class background of these women? And then my second part is, I just wondered if you could talk a little bit more about how their participation, you're kind of mentioning they're part of this revolutionary activity, but they're also advocating as women. So if you could say a little bit more about this kind of post 1916, how are they conceiving of womanhood at this time? What kind of are their ideas? Is it running alongside the suffrage movement? What are the encounters there?
Yeah, those are both great questions. So for the post 1916 time period, Cumann had this ideology that was, in order for women to be free, Ireland had to be free first. There was a lot of political debate between 1914 and 1916 among like whether Cumann was truly like a women's organization on account of them placing themselves in subsidiary roles to male revolutionaries. There were a bunch of Irish feminists like Hannah Sheehy Skeffington who would write, hit pieces on Cumann, basically saying that they were placing nation over their own liberation, which was a very valid criticism of the organization. But really, 1916 represented a turning point where a lot of the feminist critiques of Cumann at the time really started to like change their tune. For instance, Hannah Sheehy Skeffington in 1914 wrote that Cumann was nothing but women trying to debate the terms of their own oppression, right? But after 1916, she became explicitly pro-Cumann and explicitly like pro-nationalist, with this belief that an independent Ireland would be far more likely to give them rights, give them equal standing than the British Empire ever would. And so a lot of women within Cumann conceived of their participations in the nationalist and separatist arena as necessary predecessors to the suffrage movement or like the fight for women's equality. Now, I'm really happy you brought up the class issue because this was something I wanted to discuss in my presentation, and I discussed kind of at length in my paper. But Cumann was by and large an upper middle class movement. It wasn't representative of like the majority of Irish women. There was a very distinct like class separation, especially when you consider those women who served in other paramilitary organizations like the ICA, which was an explicitly working class organization. However, one thing that we have to remember is that in the post-1916 political landscape, wherein there were these laws about who could and couldn't vote, Cumann actually explicitly would break these laws. So yes, women over 30 who owned land was technically, legally, all who were allowed to vote. However, different Cumann branches would organize women of like neighborhoods of an entire city to go and vote anyway, regardless of the laws. And so mass voter fraud was committed frequently. And like they would put on new clothes and vote multiple times. And so, yes, there's definitely a class element that I didn't discuss in my presentation, but also they were more than willing to ignore that class element when it served the nationalist agenda. So, but yeah, those were two wonderful questions. Professor Dolly?
Thanks for this, Matthew. It was really enjoyable to listen to you talk about this paper that, of course, I've read and talked to you about a bunch before. And you've already actually answered the questions I was going to ask, but then another one occurred to me. So I have got one more that harkens back to another portion of our 415 conversations, which was the week we were talking about memory, historical memory. And so I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how this research and this paper might affect or could affect, in an ideal situation perhaps, how the revolution is remembered or memorialized in Ireland today.
Yeah, no, that is a phenomenal question. And I think that one thing that's really important to know that I don't think a lot of people who aren't necessarily clued into this topic would know is that the Irish Revolution is by and large depicted in explicitly masculine terms. For instance, like it celebrates like heroes, and those heroes are by and large men, or exclusively men, pretty much. If you like read, I don't like if you read poetry by people like Yeats or Seamus Heaney, or if you listen to Irish music, there is this kind of obsession with focusing on the leaders, like the martyrs, if you will. And I if nothing else, I wanted my paper to demonstrate that it's not that the Irish Revolution was neither fought by exclusively elite actors, exclusively like these martyred leaders, nor was it fought by one type of person. In fact, in the time between 1890 and 1923, it really was that the whole of Ireland was in one way or another engaged in this political discourse of revolution or separatism. And so my paper, I was hoping, would both bring Cumann into the discussion, like bring them into the analysis of the way the revolution was fought, but also just kind of show that the revolution wasn't fought by exclusively Parnell, Connolly, and Larkin, if that makes sense. Yeah. And also there were other, like, if we are going to focus on the leaders, there were people who were largely influential in the revolutionary moment who, for reasons either political or just historiographical, have been largely neglected by the cultural hegemony of the or cultural zeitgeist of the revolution. And so I kind of wanted to illuminate and analyze those people, like the people that aren't talked about, and that's what kind of brought me to this topic.
Yeah. Great, thank you.
Any other questions before we move on? Ruby.
I have one quick question, which is, did they have any of their own folk songs that you came across at all?
I haven't found any. I mean, I'm not confident enough to say they don't exist. If any of you ever find one, email it to me, please. I would love to listen to it. But no, I haven't personally come across any.
I had a last question, sorry, just to wrap it up, but do you have plans to research this further, or maybe, take this paper, publish it, maybe one day travel to Ireland, go into the archives?
I would love to travel to Ireland. I would also love to actually go to the Bureau of Military History, which is where a lot of my primary sources came from. At this time, I'm going to probably take a break from academia for at least a couple of years. But if I ever do go back to it, this is the topic that I want to spend my life studying. Like modern Irish history is like kind of my thing. So yeah, like I don't have firm plans to continue this paper, but if I were to continue anything, it would be this paper.
Well, excellent job, Matthew. That was really well done. Congratulations. Yeah, thank you.